Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the Wilder podcast. In this episode, we speak with Rob Penn from Stump Up for Trees about why tree planting still plays a critical part in addressing the climate and ecological crisis, where we should and shouldn't plant trees, and the practicalities of planting into the steep bracken banks of the Welsh uplands. How are you, Tom?
Very well. I mean, I know that you're asking that just to be polite. You don't actually want me to respond. Because if I responded, I'd just be like, I don't feel a bit lurgy, got a bit of a headache, thanks for asking. A bit, husky, you can hear my voice. And I could go on for another 5 minutes. So should we just cut it there and...
Yeah, there's enough of that. Let's move on from the lurgy household and talk about the exciting updates of the last couple of weeks.
It's been awesome. If we discount the weather and my lurgy, it has been a really good couple of weeks. There have been lots of exciting events. Chief amongst them is the new arrivals. Our chief ecosystem engineers, new employees, basically.
So, of course, Tom, you were talking about the pigs, our British saddlebacks, who are definitely cuter than I had first anticipated.
Yeah, although I was surprised when Paul, our pig man, also listening to the podcast and now becoming a good friend, he came and delivered them. And he said, well, you got to carry them by their back legs, which are not the most dignified arrival on the project.
He was absolutely chucking it down with rain, and Paul and Tom were like trying to pretend that the 25-kilo pig was a little light carry.
Yeah, I was thinking piglet, right? So I was thinking, if anyone's seen Clarkson's farm, I was thinking piglet, right?
Yeah.
But they're not. They were piglets. And we had a good, 100-meter dash to get them into the pen and hump over the sheep nest. But anyway, we've got them. We now have two very beautiful, I must say, looking employees.
And I've been really impressed by the work they've done in such a short space of time. At the moment, we've got them in a electric fenced area to help train them to the bucket of food, and then we're going to let them loose across the whole project. But the disturbance they've already created on that site is amazing.
Yeah, and they're already piglets still. They're still learning. Mm-hmm. We are going to start off with 30 acres, and then aspirationally we want to put it up to the whole area. But I still don't see how these piglets are going to even create significant disturbance, it's famous last words, over 30 acres. But we've been told they could and should use at least 80 acres, if not more, in terms of ecological disturbance and be able to manage them on the land. So it's going to be really interesting to see the impact they have. Some things I learned when they arrived, when they first came, I don't think they were used to being with each other, and there's a bit of disagreement. And it is bizarre to have these two piglets having a silent fight, basically. They didn't squeal. There was no noise. They were just trying to get the flabby bits of their ears and try and prove who was in charge.
Yeah, there's definitely some storming, forming, and now some norming, hopefully.
And those that follow us on social media, and if you really want basically a non-stop feed of pig pictures, I would recommend getting onto our WhatsApp group for more than just that. But go to grangeproject.co.uk/WhatsApp and come and join us. I think my highlight of the pigs so far, apart from how happy they sound when they see me coming in the morning, which is just wonderful, is that as I've got to know them, I now can get close to them now and give them a little scratch. And not only that, one of them now rolls over on his tummy, on his side for a little tummy scrub. It's great.
Tom does send me a lot of pig videos.
People that have kept pigs will get this. I'm not sure anyone else will. So let's move on to the next topic before we bore everyone to death.
Before we move on, do you think it might just be worth highlighting why we describe them as our ecosystem engineers and what they're actually doing on the project?
Yeah, they're not just pretty animals. Wonderful.
Social media follower.
Yeah. They're not. I was thinking about creating their own Instagram. No, I'm joking. Yes, let's do that, Chloe. And as you are the educated one amongst us, I think you should elaborate.
Oh, you put me on the spot there, Tom. So my understanding is, so the pigs do some rootling. They use their noses to turn the soil up, and that helps to create bare patches of earth. And the function of that is it opens up the soil, which then allows seeds to come and
germinate,
colonize, I don't know, appear, that might not have otherwise been able to get through the thick grass sward. Look at me. And it also creates texture to the landscape. So before the pigs came, we had a flat bed of grass, and now the area they're in is hillocky,
roughed up
and downy. Mm-hmm. And that creates different habitats. Like maybe some of the downy bits might get water in them during the winter, and that might be a habitat. And some of the uppy bits might be more, I don't know, a lookout for voles. I have no idea.
Yeah, and as the pigs get bigger, and I think we're probably looking at this roast into spectacles, but these pigs are going to get pretty large.
A third of a ton, in fact.
So, when they do want to create their own pig wallows or whatever it ends up being, they're going to be pretty big spaces of muddy, watery areas, which I think, again, these are all technical terms. And that's their job. And what we want to do is set the conditions now at this early stage of the project to allow us to rough up the ground and then set the conditions for this project becoming wilder and less like a farm, basically. And that's what they're here for. Right, one last update before we get into the main billing for today, and it is a great chat, so it's definitely worth sticking around for. Over to you, Chloe.
So at the weekend, we welcomed the Monmouthshire Botany group. It was such a lovely day, did help with the sunshine, and really friendly, lovely people. And they've produced this fantastic report, which Tom and I need to sit down and really interpret because there's a lot of Latin and things we don't understand, but equally some real enthusiasm from them about some of the things they observe, some of the different habitats we've got on the land here, and some of the opportunities in terms of future management ideas. So we'll upload that report to the website for people to have a look at if you're interested, and we would welcome them back anytime.
Definitely. Hopefully it'll be an annual thing. I'll just plant that seed now, so to speak. Now, I've got to apologise to the Botany group. I wasn't actually there for the day. I apologise to you as well, Chloe. Sorry that I wasn't there to support with the 3 kids and the 20 people and dogs and pigs and chickens. But I was. It's a humble brag time, and I'm now in training for an event.
I'm kind of impressed that we've got to this point in the podcast without you mentioning the event.
Well, I didn't. I wanted to give me an opportunity to drop out. But every year I tend to try and do one challenge. Again, it's all about body and mind. It's just making sure I try and stay as fit as I can and keep setting myself challenges beyond existing and life and all the stuff we're doing on the project. So this year, as we're so close to Offa's Dyke, which is a historic dike that straddles England and Wales, goes north to south, the internal border. And I've just always been tickled by wanting to do it, the whole thing. So found a decent charity to do it for, which is High Ground Charity. It's a military charity supporting transitioning service members from the military into civilian life or reservists who are looking for employment within land-based sectors, which is really broad, but basically I'm all about trying to get veterans onto the land and enjoying and benefiting from the things that we do every single day. I think it's hugely beneficial, and I think their skill sets lend themselves to it. So I looked it up. It takes about 2 weeks to walk it. So Chloe, I came to you and said, Chloe, I need 2 weeks to go and walk this. And your response was?
No.
And then your second response was?
We have 3 children. You're mad.
Third response?
You have to run it.
And then final response?
6 days max.
There we go. Okay. So we've got 6 days. And I was like, that'll be fine. Turns out it's the equivalent to going up Everest without the oxygen deprivation. And it's about over 30 miles a day going from north to south. So a little bit more than I was expecting, but it's going to be a huge proper challenge. I'm doing it with some great people who all turn out to be significantly fitter than me, have all competed at international level in various degrees of sporting or professional life. So I am going to be comfortably the most unfit, but I'm really looking forward to it. And please, again, just follow us on social media if you want some updates. And please do click on the link in the show notes if you're interested in looking at High Ground Charity. Right, should we go into the chat?
Absolutely. So I think this interview has something in it for everybody. Rob was so knowledgeable on such a range of subjects related to trees, woodland cover, wood security, natural capital, bracken management. There's so much to take from this.
It's exactly the type of interview that I like. It got me thinking in a way that I don't normally think. It gave me 2 or 3 knowledge bombs, as I call them, where I'm like, oh, wow, I haven't even thought about that or thought of it in this way. I think that's exactly what we try and achieve on the Wilder podcast. So enjoy. Rob, welcome to the Wilder podcast.
Thank you very much. Very good to be here.
Yeah, well, it's great. And this topic has been, I think, long in coming. And maybe we should have done it earlier, to be honest, because this shows that Chloe and I's naivety that we wanted to get into when we start to understand the impacts of climate change very early on, instantly defaulted to fight it. You have to plant trees. And I think it's such a way more complicated topic than that. So I'm really glad that you're going to give us your wisdom on this topic and help our listeners as well along the way. But before we jump into that, Rob, would you mind giving us a bit about your background and how you find yourself where you are now?
So I am a journalist and a author and broadcaster, and first time's been a TV presenter, and communicate about lots of different subjects. I write non-fiction books, and those subjects range around, but central to them really for the last kind of 15 years has been subject of trees or woodlands, forests, so everything kind of related. I've sort of tried to take in the whole range of a tree's lifetime, so that's from acorn to a table. And in learning about trees and woodlands, I have adjusted to becoming a tree planter as well as a woodsman. So I've been a woodsman for kind of 15 years. That's managing my own piece of woodland here in the Black Mountains in southeast Wales, and being heavily involved in a community woodland group, which manages very beautiful ancient semi-natural woodland near where I live. Most recently, I've become a tree planter. So set up an organisation just before COVID called Stump Up for Trees. We are a charity and our ambition is to plant 1 million trees across the Brecon Beacons area. And that is a very easy way to sell it. It's actually much more complicated and nuanced than that. Really, we use trees as a tool for ecological restoration. And I do various other things, but I think that's probably a long enough intro.
Definitely established your credentials there beautifully. Tree planting, that is what we're talking about today. For a lot of people that are uneducated, like I alluded to at the start, we just think that's the easy solution. It seems like, well, if you've got a problem, plant a tree. So can you give a bit more depth to that? So why tree planting and why is now, or probably why a generation ago have been a good time to have planted these trees?
Yeah. So it's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
Over the course of human history, tree planting's been important because we use the wood at the end of the life cycle of the tree, or even take wood in the middle of the life cycle of a tree through the practice of coppicing and pollarding. So trees have been fundamental because they provided us with, well, I'm sitting at a wooden desk on a wooden chair in an office which has a wooden floor and various other wooden desks, and there's a table, another table. So you get the point. So the drive to plant trees has been human use of the material wood, and thereby the kind of economic value which is contained within a woodland or indeed in a tree. Most recently, much more recently, we've come to understand that trees sequester carbon and release oxygen. So they have value to us as a tool to mitigate climate change because they can sequester carbon. I think in that journey of understanding about the power of a tree to sequester carbon, we've also come to understand that they deliver all sorts of other ecosystem services. And again, I think this is really relatively recently. So trees are very good tools for natural flood management, and climate change is delivering increasingly unfamiliar rainfall patterns across the world, and not least here in Wales. And you can use trees to infiltrate water where the tree grows, rather than that water running off a piece of compacted land and into a river and flooding a town, village or city further downstream. So they have a value for natural flood management. They also kind of have a value in pure biodiversity terms. So our ancient semi-natural woodlands in temperate Europe tend to be incredibly high in biodiversity. Much higher in biodiversity than, let us say, a field of agricultural pasture which has been improved with chemical fertilizers over the course of the last half century. So, if you convert a field which has been used for agriculture back to woodland over time, and we're talking about a long period of time, it will tend to support higher biodiversity than that field. So that's another way that trees can improve or assist us as human beings. So that's important. Can restore nature. There are other reasons to plant trees. They tend to improve air, soil and water quality. Lots of trees have diverse pluses, like alder, for example, which fixes nitrogen in soil. That's a positive. Not all tree species do that, but some do. So they deliver at a species level a very diverse panoply of services to the landscape, to nature and to us as humans. I think I've kind of gone through the main reasons why you want to plant trees now. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's great. No, very helpful. It's great to hear that you're so close to us as well. Out of interest, where are we currently in Wales in terms of canopy coverage, and what's our current state and what's the aspirations for the future?
This is where the problems start to arise. So the United Kingdom is a depauperate country, or depauperate island or islands. We have very few trees. We cut them down a long time ago. I can talk a bit about that if you want. But right now, we have roughly 13% tree cover. So that varies from country to country. The United Kingdom, so it's a bit higher in Wales, probably more like 14%, a little bit lower in England, more like 11%, and then higher in Scotland, probably more like 16%, I think. And then by county, huge differences. So Sussex, 23%, Surrey, I think it's around about 22%, Lincolnshire, 1%, Norfolk, 2%. So county by county, huge disparity across the United Kingdom, but generally speaking, 13%. So if you use that as your benchmark figure, national average across European countries is 37%. So we're basically a third the national average across European countries for woodland cover. So that's tree canopy cover. If you want to go elsewhere to look for comparisons, sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. I always kind of reference this one. So Japan, roughly the sort of same area of territory as us, roughly the same population. Tree cover 67%. I understand that the topography of Japan is completely different to ours, but nonetheless, it's worth reflecting on these things. When did we cut our trees down? A long time ago. If you extrapolate the figures that we have from the Doomsday Book, 1086, that gives you about 11% woodland cover in 1086. So the Angles and the Saxons, who are great agriculturalists, tended to cut the trees of these islands down a long time ago. And we've been short of trees and timber ever since. We became one of the largest, possibly the largest importer of timber on the planet in Tudor times. And today we are somewhere around the second or third largest importer of timber on the planet after China. We import about 84% of our timber needs. So we are not in a good state with respect to trees. Governments, England, Wales, Scotland, set targets which are part of their net zero targets by 2050. And that is to increase tree cover. And I think, if I'm right in saying, I can't remember the absolute detail on this, but I think for England and Wales, it's to increase tree cover to 16%. So that's 30% or 14% to 16%. Scotland are already well on the way. Scotland had a very good tree planting scheme, very successful government-led tree planting scheme over the last 10 years. They are beginning to pull back from that right now because of budgetary issues. So they withdrew £30 million from their woodland creation scheme at the end of winter this year. So that's kind of problematic. But basically, Scotland's done quite well. England and Wales have still got an awfully long way to go. And the ball is rolling, but it's rolling pretty slowly.
Thank you, Rob. It's so interesting to hear about some of those ecosystem services and the ecological benefits of trees, and as well as the history and some of the context about where we are now. We lived in the Forest of Dean for about 10 years, and there's something in terms of the value of trees for people as well. I think the kind of, there's the leisure opportunities, you can walk in the trees, you can cycle in them, but also it's just the beauty in that. I can't really describe it, but when you're in a forest and you have that sense of the interconnectivity and the wilderness around you, that kind of really speaks to you in a way that it's hard to describe. And given kind of all this, the value we know that are inherent in trees and tree planting, I guess one of the dilemmas that sometimes gets raised is where we should be planting trees and what opportunity there is in such a crowded island like Britain, where we have issues around food security and trying to privilege our land use for agriculture. How do we kind of marry that up with some of the benefits that you're talking about in terms of tree planting?
Yeah, that's the kind of, issue that's facing us as a society at the moment, right? Where do we find the space to do this? I personally think we farm inefficiently. And I think we could do it a lot better. We're here to talk about trees. We're not talking about food waste right now, but I'm a great advocate of not wasting food. Huge problem. But I think farming, we could do it much more efficiently. There is plenty of space. We would argue at Stump Up Trees, there is plenty of space for afforestation of our landscape. So that starts for me with restitution of hedges. So putting hedgerows back, incredibly valuable to wildlife, and trees in hedgerows sequester carbon. Just two massive ticks for a very incrementally tiny loss of agricultural land. And we do have a great network of hedgerows across the United Kingdom, particularly in Wales. It's something we should be proud of. And where there are gaps, we need to fill those. And I don't think that is particularly controversial. At least I hope it's not. Moving on, there is space within agricultural land, so that's field corners where you can't get machinery into, and slightly wider hedges to create shelter belts. There's a lot of science now that shows that agricultural productivity goes up with good shelter belts on a farm. So I think that's, again, we're talking about small amounts of land, but that's could take place on all farms. So that's field corners where you can't get a piece of machinery around, and shelter belts to create agricultural productivity. And then I think there is, and this is kind of where we're focusing on working at the moment, there is just in Wales in particular, and definitely in Scotland, but also in places like Cumbria and the Pennines in England, a huge space for afforestation on what we call upland wood pasture. So that's the transition from in-by land or agricultural land or pasture, whatever you want to call it, the transition before you get to the peat, or the mountain, the bare rock, and before you get to the tree line. And that is a layer. So in Wales, North Wales, it's called Ffrwyth, and in South Wales, it's called Coeca or Coed Kai Wood Field. Pretty much explains what it is. It's the transition from field to mountain. So it's wood field. So it's upland wood pasture. And we think that there is just hundreds of thousands of hectares of space for this. And at the moment, that is very, very low-grade agricultural pasture. So sheep are turned out there. Not many cattle. Cattle wouldn't be a bad thing. Sheep, almost no other livestock, no pigs, almost exclusively sheep, turned out into this pasture, and it is covered in bracken. So it's losing biodiversity as we speak, and it's definitely lost biodiversity over the last 30, 40 years as stocking densities have decreased. And it is very low-grade agricultural land, and we think that that could be repurposed. All sorts of benefits, but particularly biodiversity and carbon sequestration through the planting and management of trees.
Do you mean stocking densities have increased, not decreased?
No, they have decreased on the mountain because fewer and fewer farmers are. Well, so one, government policy has paid farmers to reduce stocking density on the hill. And this kind of happened 20 years ago with glass-tier schemes in Wales. And they didn't really have a view of the unintended consequences, which would be reduction of biodiversity. They thought it was a good thing, right? So they encouraged farmers. And actually, that is the way society was going anyway. So there are fewer commoners who actively turn out on the uplands because it's a kind of way of life which is quietly diminishing. It's really hard work. And we think that the unintended consequence of taking the stock off was that bracken has had a field day. I can talk a lot about bracken. It's not necessarily a subject many people are interested in, but it is an incredible plant, and it's not to do with trees. But the old adage is that bracken hates trees and trees hate bracken. So the one thing that bracken doesn't really like is shade. It's an incredibly powerful plant, nicknamed the perfect weed. It's been around for 55 million years or more. And like all plants, it wants to take over the world. And it looks like it's having a pretty good go at it. And unlike most plants, I think it's got a reasonable prospect of taking over the world. I'm joking. It is increasingly covering our uplands to the detriment of biodiversity. That's my issue. And trees are a mechanism of controlling it. So are cattle, so are pigs. Sheep are not.
That's really interesting hearing about that role of bracken and what it's trying to achieve. And we've got a little patch of bracken as part of our 80 acres that we've had lots of different advice about what we should do with it, how we should manage it, what it's trying to do. We maybe naively thought it was part of this transitional habitat into becoming woodland. And if we just left it for long enough, the saplings would start to come through because it was protecting them. And in fact, we did a little bit of tree planting in the bracken to try and test that out as a theory. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about your experience in that.
Okay, so bracken is a woodland plant, so its natural habitat is under trees. In that instance, and if you travel through some of the kind of very sandy soil woodlands of Surrey, for example, the kind of lowland heath, that you'll find bracken in all of those woodlands. And it is very lightly planted, and it grows to about 4 foot, and it has rather delicate fronds, and it is, dare I say it, a rather beautiful fern. And that is its natural habitat. You fell those trees, and the bracken suddenly starts planting itself at a stem every 10 centimetres, and it grows to 8 foot without shade. And then it becomes a problem because it is a very well-developed plant, so it shades out competition. It secretes allelopathic chemicals into the ground to suppress germination of other seeds and plants, so the seeds of other plants. And when it particularly dies back in autumn, as it does every year, as you know, and you're on a slope, the bracken falls downhill and creates this incredible tilth, which lands on top of small nascent saplings, tree saplings we're talking about, and smothers them. And that basically kills the tree. And that is why natural regeneration or recolonization of bracken slopes or banks is incredibly slow, painfully slow, if it happens at all. So we advocate that you need to manage the trees through the bracken until they are 6, 7, 8 foot and tall enough to withstand the bracken which falls on top of them. We call it assisted natural regeneration, which is effectively what it is. But that is why bracken is a problem, because it will just dominate and dominate and dominate. We don't really know. There's no really accurate scientific information, but it's thought that there are 100,000 hectares of bracken-covered uplands in Wales alone. Bracken cover is spreading across the United Kingdom somewhere between 1 and 3% increase annually at the moment. So the evidence, again, we're a bit too early to have any scientific evidence on this, so this is anecdotal. The anecdotal evidence seems that it's adapting very well to climate change. Clever plant. It's got great mechanisms, and it is a survivor. I won't go on, but ivy and brambles and bracken are 3 plants which aren't necessarily good for woodlands, which seem to be adapting quite well to climate change. That is anecdotal, but that's what I'm gathering, talking to woodsmen up and down the United Kingdom. Anyway, that's bracken. It seems to be adapting quite well, and it's spreading. And getting trees through it is problematic on slopes, and that's what we're talking about. That is the area, the Freed, the Quaker, the upland wood pasture, bracken banks at the moment, and that could be much more interesting, mosaic, incredibly vital landscape habitat as far as we're concerned, here in Wales particularly. So when you've got really good upland wood pasture, it includes wet areas, acid heathland, gorse, bilberry, heather, shrub areas of blackthorn and hawthorn grown together into a thicket, possibly even bramble thickets, good habitat. And in amongst all of that, you've got wood pastures. So you've got trees growing which provide shade, and the bracken doesn't like that. So that's good wood pasture, upland wood pasture. Bad upland wood pasture or Quaker or Freed is basically bracken.
And the presence of bracken over this pasture, that would be an indicator that it historically was a woodland. Is that right?
It's a very good indicator. It's not foolproof, but it's a very good indicator. And at this time of year, for me, now's the moment in the year where you want to be looking for some of the woodland species that will grow in and around the fringes of bracken. So a very good example is wood anemones. So if you find wood anemones, and you won't find them in the thick bracken, but you'll find them where there's a grass path going through the bracken, you'll find wood anemones on the edge of the path. That, for me, is a better indicator that this used to be woodland. But, wood anemones and the bracken, that's a home run for me. That means that site used to be woodland, yeah.
At our place, we have quite a lot of bluebells coming through in the bracken, and we wonder whether that kind of suggests, again, that it did have a woodland heritage.
Bluebells are the same. It's not foolproof, but they're a very good indicator.
You've completely sold to me the benefits of planting on wood pasture and creating that sort of habitat. But given it seems such an obvious course of action, what are some of the challenges associated with taking that course?
God, blimey. So it is, in government policy terms, it's an overlooked habitat. It's relatively complicated to define, and so policymakers tend to skip over it. So it doesn't have clear designation, so it's quite difficult to get a grant, let us say, from a government, one of our UK governments, to create it when it would be the right thing to do, rather than planting new native woodland. Another problem is accessibility. It's difficult getting vehicles onto 35 degree in steepness bracken banks. If you're carrying trees up there, you tend to have to carry them on your back because you can't get vehicle access. So it's problematic from the logistics point of view, and then it's quite expensive because the management tends to be, it has to be intense for the first few years, whilst the life of the small sapling is so very precarious because of the bracken falling on top of it. So you basically need boots on the ground. You need to be there. One of the ways that bracken has been controlled historically in the past, for a variety of reasons, or for anyone who wants to control bracken, was use of the chemical azulox. That's now been banned as of this year, 2024. I think it's been banned in Europe for a while. I don't have the data on that, but I think it's been banned in Europe for a while. Anyway, it's now gone. The United Kingdom landowners and managers can't use that azulox anymore. And that has put the frighteners on lots of people. So lots of people used chemical, which knocked it back. It didn't kill it, but it knocked it back for several years, which would allow saplings to get away. Now we're going to have to manage bracken banks to make sure that trees become established. Planting a tree on a flat field and putting a deer guard round it and watching it grow, that doesn't happen on the bracken banks.
So asking for a friend that might be trying to plant some trees in bracken, what are some of the management techniques that would be suggested? I've actually seen a few things on your website, or through social media, that have been really helpful. And it sounds quite experimental, some of the things you guys are testing.
True. If the ground is flat, it's nothing more than, Tom's already mentioned it, the bracken will hide your saplings from deer. That's a tick, right? That's a positive.
Oh, yeah.
It will also hide them from sheep if sheep manage to get into the place where you planted trees. It's not uncommon around here. So those are real pluses. Then, when the bracken dies back, you have to walk past that sapling in winter, or some point between the end of November and the beginning of the growing season, March, and the trees start to come into leaf. You have to walk past that sapling and clear the bracken off the top of it. Then you can advantage yourself by planting fast-growing species. So we tend to favour rowan, tree of the uplands, very fast-growing, grows at 1 metre a year. It, I would argue, is pre-adapted to getting through bracken. So it stays pencil thin, doesn't spread out lateral branches, just keeps going up, up, up for the first few years. So, you plant a 60 centimetre rowan sapling, and within 3 years, it's 2 metres tall and it's through the bracken, right? Other species which grow at 1 metre a year: alder, downy birch, silver birch, sweet chestnut. So these are all fast-growing species. And then your hazel and your oak and your hawthorn, you plant under those fast-growing trees. So in effect, you're asking the fast-growing species like rowan and alder and downy birch to nurse the slower-growing trees. So there is a kind of succession thing working there. Maintenance and being selective about the species that you plant. We've got 2 methodologies which we're running on different sites. So one is on Bryn Arw. So on Bryn Arw, which is an upland site, planted 135,000 trees on 65 hectares 3 winters ago. What we're doing there is mowing the bracken, by which I mean we're mowing it in late summer to reduce the volume of bracken that can fall downhill onto our saplings by 4/5. It's really labour intensive. It's working. We're 3 years in. It's definitely working, but it's really labour intensive. Nobody else has adopted it, even though it's working. I think it's too labour intensive for people to countenance. The other method, which we're still in the process of implementing, is to put long stakes or bamboo canes in a tripod formation over the trees, tie them off at the top as a tripod, and that creates a framework that catches the bracken when it falls downhill, when it dies back in autumn, and it stops the sapling from being smothered. That is experimental. We have trialled it on Bryn Arw. We've incrementally changed what we tried on Bryn Arw, but we think it'll work. And that's less management. So each year, somebody will have to walk past all of those tripods and hook off the dead bracken. But we think that will be less management than the mowing. It's not easy.
No.
There's lots of barriers, but I think it's really important and critical that it takes place and works. And going back to the beginning, of our conversation, it is basically non-contentious with respect to the issue of taking land out of agricultural production, because it's such low and poor grazing that some commoners, farmers, a very conservative bunch of people within a conservative part of society are resistant to it. But I think increasingly a lot will accept that it is a good way to mitigate the climate and biodiversity crisis.
I assume on your website you've got before, afters, during images of the work that you've been doing, so people can go on there.
Yes, it's not brilliant, the documenting of it, I have to admit, but we're getting there, yes.
We are also dealing with the challenges of how best to display effect.
Yeah.
It is a hard challenge, but there is a work in progress from our side as well at some point.
I know, because you want to make it engaging and interesting for people.
And just easy to navigate, easy to understand, easy to see visually. Within a few, see something complicated within a few images, and for them to get what they want.
Yeah. So one of the other barriers, answer your last question, Chloe, establishing wood pasture, upland wood pasture again, is it takes bloody ages to explain it. So at Stump Up Trees, we get a lot of sponsorship from business, and local businesses and businesses from elsewhere in the United Kingdom. A lot of what we do is paid for by businesses, and they ring us up and say, we'd like to plant some trees. And we go, well, actually, it's not quite about planting trees. It's a bit more complicated. Have you got a few minutes? And they're like, no.
So glad you brought that up. And I think it's really important. It brings me back to something I wrote down at the start of this chat. It's, for the layman, it's very easy for people to understand that trees equal solution to climate change. And they don't want to know any more than that.
Yeah.
So I suppose it's an open question back to you. Is it a panacea? Is it the solution? And if it's not, then what's the right balance?
It's definitely not the solution. Is it part of the solution? Without question. We need more trees. If there wasn't a climate crisis, we'd need more trees. If there wasn't a nature crisis, we would currently, where we are in the United Kingdom right now, need more trees. I would argue we need more of everything, right? So we need more rewilded land. We need more native woodlands. We need more hedgerows with native trees. And, like it or not, we need more conifers. We're importing 84% of our timber needs at the moment. That is not healthy. When people say to me, you can't take land out of agricultural production because there are food security issues, I don't understand how you can consider food security without considering timber security in the same conversation. Has to be considered. No one is cognizant of this fact, but the largest softwood lumber exporter on the planet currently, today, is Russia.
Huh.
So we think they've got us over a barrel with gas, but they've also got us over a barrel with our softwood. It's not a healthy place to be. So if you want to talk about food security, I've got issues about talking about food security.
Yeah.
People conflate food security with food self-sufficiency. They're two completely different things. We don't have a food security issue. America will feed us if everything goes wrong, as they did during 2 world wars. Food security is not an issue. Food self-sufficiency is something we should discuss. But I think you want to discuss it by becoming more accurate and better land users and better farmers, rather than having a reductive argument that it's about trees or food. That's rubbish.
I would define this conversation as you dropping a number of knowledge bombs for me here, and I'm really, really enjoying it. Everything was clear, but I really love it when one of our guests gives me a point of view that I hadn't seen before. And I think when you get into what we're doing, you start to look at these conifer plantations, and when people cut it down and you start to tut and suck your teeth at but wood needs to be produced. And I just love having another perspective, and that's Chloe and I will probably go away and have a really good chinwag about that and see how that fits into our image that we're starting to paint for ourselves about how best we help solve these solutions. So I could just see Chloe's got her hand up here, and you don't have to, we're not at school, but go on, Chloe. What's the question?
Taking us back a little bit to what you were saying, Rob, about the expense of planting in these environments. And you mentioned there about businesses as a source of funding. And I guess so when it comes to mind is what are the other sources of funding? I know with the Sustainable Farming Scheme in Wales, there's an idea that 10% of all farms will have tree coverage. What the funding will be for that, I guess, is still a bit unclear. But there's also these ideas around natural capital. And I kind of wonder what your perspective was on that.
So, yes, funding is a kind of major issue, particularly for what we were just talking about, upland wood pasture or koika or free creation or restoration, because it's expensive. It's much more expensive than planting a hedgerow, for example. Government funding is, there is government funding. Generally speaking, people who use government funding for woodland creation in England and Wales complain about it. I think it's kind of quite problematic. The bureaucracy is a bit leaden and slow and not particularly precise, I would argue. But there is still funding there. The enormity of the task in terms of what we need to do with respect to woodland creation to mitigate the climate and nature crisis, the enormity of the task means that government funding is definitely not going to pay for it, right? That is not a solution. So we need to look elsewhere for money. You mentioned businesses. So at Stump Up for Trees, we've raised 1.7 million for woodland creation in Wales. That's all come from business, with the exception of a couple of small grants from philanthropic foundations. But it's nearly all come from business. And I think there is an increasing awareness amongst business and employees. This is in the ESG and CSR parts of modern businesses that supports conservation, good practice in conservation. So we've been very encouraged about how businesses speak to us and what they want to achieve. And they definitely need educating. They come to us and say, we'd like to plant a tree. We say it's much more complicated than that. Just, getting a spade and sticking one in the deck. Generally speaking, they are engaged, though. If you can get the right people across the table to listen, then Anyway, I think business is going to be hugely important in conservation going forward in the United Kingdom. Also, you referenced natural capital. I'm into all of it. I think it's going to pay for a huge amount of conservation going forward. I wish the markets were to develop faster. I don't think the carbon market is perfect. It might be a long way from perfect, but I still think it's important. We need it. We don't want to get rid of it. We just need to improve it. I'm pro it. Has it licensed some poor tree planting in the last 3, 4, 5 years? Unquestionably it has. It's encouraged some really average or poor tree planting, but that doesn't mean we need to scrap it. We just need to improve it. And then the other natural capital markets, for me, they can't come soon enough, particularly natural flood management and biodiversity. I think that the biodiversity credit system is probably going to come first before natural flood management. And we would like that to emerge speedily, because I think that that is the market that will really speed up what we're trying to do. So the upland wood pasture, Quaker freed creation. So I'm sort of very interested in the biodiversity net gain market. It's called something different in Wales. It's quietly coming. I can see it, and it will be government backed, and that's really important. So it's something which will run alongside the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code in the first instance, but there will probably also be a voluntary market which will emerge alongside the government backed market for biodiversity, and I think it's really important. And I think that will put money into rewilding, natural regeneration, natural recolonisation, all things which are really difficult to draw down government grants for right now.
Well, that's a hopeful note for us. And I guess wanting to give you an opportunity now as a bit of a platform to share some about Stump Up for Trees, how it came about, what you're working on, and what your aspirations are for the charity in the future.
It came about through a series of conversations with my neighbour in the pub. And over those conversations came to understand that the kind of macro forces of climate change, incremental change in human dietary habits, and the end of the common agricultural policy because of Brexit created an unprecedented, in our lifetimes, unprecedented opportunity for us to engage in and imagine what the ideal future landscape might look like and engage in achieving it. That is why we set up the charity. We both believe that a more wooded Southeast Wales would be good for everything and everyone. And then we set up Stump Up for Trees to try and achieve that. And we planted about 1/3 trees, just under now. A lot of those in hedgerows and shelter belts. And then a lot in what we've been talking about, which is upland wood pasture or quicker. And that is what we want to do more of. More hedgerows, more shelter belts, more field corners, some small pockets of native woodland, but we don't want to take good agricultural land out of production now. And then we want to plant on the marginal agricultural land in the uplands and try and reduce the impact of bracken. And really, our key driver is enhancing biodiversity, but there are many benefits of planting trees. But the key one for us is enhancing biodiversity. We work with landowners. We have amazing community of volunteers. Feels like it's been quite a long journey, but we are under team.
And I would encourage everyone to have a look on social media, because he recently published a video, I think, where some of the volunteers talked about their experiences of tree planting with the project. And it was so wonderful because it really echoed our reflections on the kind of volunteers or community day we had here, because people really talked about the benefits it had to them personally, socially, getting outdoors, doing something meaningful. Like it was a really inspiring video, and such a great diversity of volunteers you had sort of talking about those experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the one thing that we absolutely, Keith and I, did not consider when we set up Stump Up Trees was the volunteer community. We worked hard to understand how you get money to plant trees and where best to plant them and how to be accurate when you plant them. We didn't really think about volunteers, and it's, without question, the most magical thing that the charity has achieved. Lovely.
I agree completely. All your links to your websites, social media will be in the show notes, but I'm just looking at the video currently playing on your website of the signage on the side of the hillside. Where else was that?
So that's on Bryn Arw. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, so basically during that, we set the charity up and we were doing the pre-planting preparation on Bryn Arw during the first lockdown. And we were pretty bored, so we cut in bracken letters which are 40 metres tall and we cut out the Welsh words dau eso ddail afryn, which translates as there will be leaves on the mountain again.
Huh.
And we have planted that subsequently with hawthorn in the hope that at some point, possibly within the next decade, those trees will blossom with Mayflower in the month of May in the shape of the letters. I don't know if it'll work, but we live in hope.
I always like a poetic end to an episode. So, Rob, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your knowledge and sharing it with us. It's very inspirational what you're doing, and I'm really looking forward to following the project as we go forward.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you both.
When Rob gave that translation of the Welsh, there will be leaves on the mountain again, I got all the goose pimples off my spine.
Yeah, and as we don't live that far away from that project, it is going to be wonderful to be able to drive past it and to see it, be reminded of the project and of Rob and this chat. I just think it's great. And it's just that slow evolution of my brain when I now look at the conifer plantations and realise the obvious importance of wood when you think about it and the need for it to be part of the nation strategy. So now when I do see these bare hillsides, there is a positive side to it. Now, there are people I've spoken to who say there are ways in which you can manage these plantations in a way that you can generate wood from them and also manage them for biodiversity. So I think there are ways in which this can be done well. But even with the woods near us, they've stripped out a big chunk of the wood for wood. But if you walk through it now, it was only 6 months ago, and you can just see the green shoots coming underneath it and the biodiversity that's now going to sprout up in that place. And I just think there is a place for that as well.
So one of the dilemmas we've been wrestling with over the last few months is around tree planting versus natural regeneration. And I think Rob's interview was a really good example about how it's the right tree in the right place using the right management techniques. So it's not a simple conversation. But the one point that I felt we hadn't perhaps touched on, but I think is a really important one, is the engagement opportunity of tree planting as well. How you bring a group of people together, they look at a hillside that looks bare, maybe covered in bracken, and actually at the end of the day they leave and there are trees all over that, and how that really helps people feel both connected to nature and that they've taken some really purposeful action to change that. And actually I met one of the volunteers for Stump Up for Trees a couple of weeks ago in Botany, and she was saying exactly that, how it really helps her to manage some of the concerns she has for climate, to know she's taken that positive action and she can really see the evidence of that.
Yeah, I think we've got to caveat that with, which is obviously what happens with Stump Up for Trees, is it has to be led by people that understand trees, who understand where the right places are, because there are a number of organisations out there that help corporates plant trees, and they just buy up land and plant trees everywhere on that land and then move on to the next place to do it again. And the whole point of Rob's saying is that there needs to be a lot more intelligence behind that, and strategy and tradesmanship, for lack of a better word. But that's what I'm saying. I think you've got to make sure that if you're doing it, you do it right for the right reasons in the right way.
The other point I wanted to touch on is Rob was talking about the benefits of natural capital. And I know there probably will have been people listening to the podcast that will have been shouting some of the counter arguments around that approach. And I think that's probably a whole other podcast episode in itself to dive into that subject, because it's an increasing conversation that we're stepping into about the problems and possibilities of that way of operating.
There will be equally a number of people who don't understand what natural capital is who are listening. This is probably far too simplistic, but it is government-backed schemes that will provide funding for increasing carbon sequestration and capture on your land, or biodiversity on your land, etc. So there's quite significant amounts of money theoretically that can be generated from doing those things, which of course is a positive for the world, but then it throws up in challenges for people taking advantage of it and not doing it properly. And then also, how do you police people to make sure they are fulfilling on the promises that they do?
And there are also concerns raised about, do we need to monetize nature as well? Is this really the direction we want to go in? And I'm not going to speak with any knowledge about that, but it would be great if anyone knows anyone that would speak with more authority on that subject, please get in touch.
It's a capitalist world, Chloe.
And then look where that's got us.
Oh, but I'm not saying it's good, but it is the world it is. So, okay, well, hopefully everyone's enjoyed this podcast. If you continue to enjoy it, I say every week, rating and reviewing is massive. If you're in a safe place now, you've got time, just pause this or stop this, get yourself onto whatever platform you listen to. Please leave us a review. Firstly, it's wonderful for us to read them. And secondly, it makes a difference in terms of the ranking, which then increases the number of people that listen to the podcast. Right, until next episode, Chloe, are you finished?
I am indeed.
See you next episode.